Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is John Bohrer. He's a reporter, historian, and television news producer. He's helped produce high-profile interviews, including with nearly every major 2016 presidential candidate. His research has been cited in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. Bohrer's writings have appeared in the New York Magazine, New Republic, Politico, Today, and many others. The Revolution of Robert Kennedy, his first book, and that's what we're going to talk about today, The Revolution of Robert Kennedy, From Power to Protest After JFK. And I just got to say, John, it's a really gutsy thing to take an enigma like this on as your first book.
Yeah, it is a huge subject, and I think I was able to get a piece of his life that is really undercovered, because Robert Kennedy, people know the White House years, the Kennedy White House years, and they also know the 68 campaign. And I think those are these two mountains of his life. But in between those two places, you have a person who's very different on each of those mountains. And in between those two places, there's this valley that he goes through. And I wanted to write about that period, and because it's a time of change, and I think that's really the message of Robert Kennedy is there's change in the world, and we need to accept it and see how we can make it better. So, yeah, that's really the challenge.
He was extraordinary in that he was unsure of what he really wanted, but he knew that youth were the key, and he knew that he was in the shadow of Jack. He wanted to make a difference in the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. That became difficult.
Yeah, so Robert Kennedy's life from November 22nd, 1963 was embodied by change. It was in quick, incredibly rapid fall from power. If you think about it, on November 22nd, 1963, he woke up, the brother of the president, the Attorney General of the United States, the chief foreign policy advisor to the President of the United States in many ways, chief domestic policy advisor, chief political advisor. All of a sudden, all of that changes. And not only does that change, Robert Kennedy's purpose in life changes on that day, because from the time he graduated law school to that day in Dallas, he had worked towards his brother's goals. He had never had a goal that was not his brother's. And that purpose in life, that guiding North Star, completely gone. He has to decide what he wants to do for the first time in his life. And he quickly realizes he wants to continue his brother's legacy in some way, but he doesn't know how to do it. And he decides to go with the most conventional means of power, which is seeking the vice presidency under Lyndon Johnson. And it's different from it is today because they didn't have the 25th Amendment back then, so there was no succession of presidential power. Much like when Franklin Roosevelt died and Harry Truman became president, there was no vice president for all those years. So there was not going to be a vice president for 11 months after President Kennedy was assassinated. The Democratic National Convention of 1964 was going to have the choice in the vice presidential nomination. Now, President Johnson was going to have the majority of the influence over that, but it was also controlled by these power brokers, not the primary system. And so Robert Kennedy and his allies had to wage this sort of stealth campaign to influence them. And I was shocked by how much I was able to uncover by going back through all the memorandum and the correspondence and the travel logs and the date books and seeing what he did, which was much more extensive than anyone has really uncovered before.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of subtleties in there that I'd love to get into in some detail. I mean, the first thing is that back then the primaries weren't the deciding factor, it was the political bosses. And that's very different than how it is today, right?
That's very different than how it is today. And even the primaries were different back then. Most people would be shocked to learn that in the New Hampshire primary, it was a complete write-in in 1964. And not only was it a write-in for the presidency, it was a write-in for the vice presidency. So you could write in who you wanted your delegates to vote for in that nomination battle. Very quickly, the governor of New Hampshire wanted to pass a sweepstakes, a lottery amendment, and he realized that there was all this excitement on the Republican side of the ticket, and no excitement on the Democratic side, and he was worried that was going to take him down, his amendment down for the lottery, and so they quickly devised that we can get an extra 30,000 votes in this primary if we have a vice presidential race here. And a couple of them decided to get behind a write-in Bobby Kennedy to sort of capture this, I think, really Democratic base that wanted to do something for the president. They wanted to show their affection for the president, really President Kennedy, I would mean to say, in any way they could, the slain president. And so they do that. There is a advisor of Robert Kennedy, sort of a person who is given these jobs that no one else wants. He's the guy who Bobby has plausible deniability about and can keep his distance from, Paul Corbin. He goes to New Hampshire. Lyndon Johnson finds out. He's very upset about it. He and Bobby have an argument over it. Eventually, Lyndon Johnson forces Bobby to get him out of New Hampshire. But even after that, he's still in close contact with these aides to the governor and these Democratic operatives in New Hampshire who are ginning up this vote. And in the end, the expectation is that Bobby's going to get more votes in this primary than the president of the United States, and Lyndon Johnson. And they luck out in some ways because there's a shock write-in on the Republican side as well for the ambassador to South Vietnam at the time. And so the whole story gets kind of overshadowed, but it creates such a tension between President Kennedy, President Johnson, and Attorney General Kennedy that Lyndon Johnson privately muses to his aide Bill Moyers, and this is also something I uncovered, that I should ask him to resign tomorrow. He says that on the eve of the New Hampshire primary. And Moyers quickly talks him out of it, but it's one of those revealing moments about how much Lyndon Johnson was agitated by Robert Kennedy and his vice presidential movement, and that's just the beginning of it.
It really is, and we don't want to leave out the name of that Vietnamese ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, who just came to the forefront in New Hampshire. But this Corbin guy had a certain character that was different than most political operatives. He was like feared and not trusted, and he was Paul was this gruff guy who got his start in trade unions, and he actually had a background with the Communist Party a little bit that had prevented him from getting hired by the Kennedy administration, because otherwise Bobby wanted to bring him in to the executive branch, but the FBI and Congress wouldn't let that happen. So Paul goes to work for the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, where he is just terrorizing a lot of these local politicians. In the 1960 campaign, one of Paul's jobs was to organize in New York State where the local Democratic Party was weak. He would go in, create a Republicans or Independents for Kennedy group, and just really get on the nerves of the local Democratic leaders. It was a job that you wouldn't really want to have if you wanted a future for yourself in politics. But Paul wasn't interested in that. Paul was interested in serving the Kennedys, serving Bobby Kennedy particularly. Even Bobby would say that he's loyal to me. He's somewhat loyal to JFK. But the story of Paul Corbin goes on in that he goes to New Hampshire and really sticks out like a sore thumb, because at the Democratic National Committee, he had a map on his wall of all the counties of New York, and in each county he had a red flag or a blue flag. The blue flag was for county chairman he was okay with. The red flag was for guys he said, we're going to replace you. So he would just bring people in and just terrorize them. But so this is, we're talking about the person he was a terribly effective organizer, though, and this is the person who went in and got the ball rolling for Bobby in New Hampshire. And now it's never really clear whether or not Bobby knew, but there's a certain deniability that Bobby keeps insisting upon, even in interviews months after it's established that Corbin had been in New Hampshire. Corbin was organized for the vice presidency. Now the question is, why was Bobby denying that for history? And I think that's something maybe we'll find out one day when there are some more papers released. But right now, those things are under seal. It's still modern history. It's really fun. Yeah. The vice presidency campaign, I want to go into a little bit more, but before we do, I want to back up a step, because in the weeks leading up to the assassination, Bobby felt he was becoming politically toxic, and he spoke to Jack before the re-election campaign about getting out because he was going after the mob bosses and he was going after civil rights legislation, and he felt like he was going to cost Jack a great deal politically if he stayed in office. So he thought about resigning, and yet he stayed on.
Yes. So in November of 1963, particularly beginning in the weeks before that, he noticed that the attention was shifting from Robert Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, to the Kennedy brothers, and he started to feel that his battles were becoming too closely associated with the president, and he needed to change things. Because you need to remember what Bobby's role was, and that was the person who said no when Jack said, "I'm sorry," as the columnist Mary McGrory wrote.
That's important. He was the tough guy. Jack was not, right?
In the years before they were in the White House, when JFK had an office in the old Senate office building, these people who were seeking favors would come to his office and make some sort of incredible demand. And JFK would smile and nod, and he'd say, "Well, go talk to Bobby about that." And they would go down to Bobby's office in the basement, and their little brother's face said no. And that was their role. And that's how it went. And so, but that was starting to be, Bobby felt he was becoming a liability. And he told the president, it's time we should get me out. I can't go run the campaign because people will still think I'm involved, still important. And JFK said, no, it's going to look like we're running out on civil rights. It's going to look like we're running away from the tough political battles. We can't do that. And so that's how it is. It's very tough to get a family member out of the administration. And so, it would look like weakness. And so that's what JFK decided, and so he was going to stick with it. But Bobby was not happy, and in the day before the assassination, they had a birthday party for him at the Justice Department where a couple of his friends just said he looked completely bereft.
Well, that was something I didn't know, was that his birthday was 2 days before the assassination. That's a fascinating part of history that I don't think anybody was aware of, that his birthday was November 20th, and November 22nd, Jack Kennedy was murdered.
Yes, 38 years old, and the last day he saw his brother alive. So he had a certain sadness.
Let's talk about a little bit more about the personality of Bobby. The Kennedys didn't cry is one thing that you write in this book, and Joe Kennedy is part of why that happened, right?
Right, correct. So in reflecting upon JFK's virtues after the assassination, one thing that Bobby wrote about was how even in times of when he was suffering in great pain, when he was near death, that he never let people know how much it was. They said that you would notice people who knew him well would see his face was a little whiter, that his words were a little sharper, but those who didn't know him well detected nothing at all. And that goes back to the idea of Kennedys don't cry. And we know that as sort of like the family lore, the hard-hearted edict of Father Joe, this ruthless tycoon and ambassador to Great Britain. But what Rose Kennedy, the mother, would say was that it was not about toughness. It was not about a must-win idealism. It was about not letting others know, sharing your burden as much. And the life is going to have a lot of bruises to everyone, but we need to be tough and bear it. And so in some ways, the idea of Kennedys don't cry is sometimes misconstrued, and I think it really, and this is the lesson that Bobby took along, was that Kennedys don't cry so that others might not cry as well. So, that's true, and yet in the book you talk about how it feels like Bobby never got over grieving for the loss of his brother. It's profound when you think about it, and he's in some of these interviews and in public events where he just breaks down and there are tears in his eyes, and he's clearly weeping. And he goes silent when he's speaking at times, just because the emotions are too powerful for him. It's something that you don't really see, but again, people associated him, I think, somewhat with grief. One of the reasons why when he would go out into the public, people would be clamoring to touch him and to just get close and to say something to him or just look him in the face. Maybe they don't even say anything because they can't, as some people said. They wanted to share their grief with him. He was a walking touchstone of national mourning in those years, and in such a way, because when you think about how he looked and how he sounded, he was a reminder of the slain president. And as time goes on, he just, he's the thing that changes is he's growing in the decade. The hair gets longer. He looks like he has experienced some of the 60s that his brother led the United States into.
He looks so much like his brother. But I want to go back to the R word. You mentioned ruthless. A lot of people label this guy ruthless. Well, why was that?
In part, it was the function of his job as his brother's campaign manager and political enforcer. In part, it was the job as the nation's top law enforcement official who had to carry out court orders and had to be tough. But mostly it was because people thought he put politics over principle and that he was about winning no matter what. And he didn't have to have any of the smoothness that JFK had. As smooth as JFK was, Bobby was considered rough. And, one of their closest aides said once to a columnist that, JFK could be tough with you, but Bobby really barked at you. He could have done things in a softer way. So with this rough nature, this sort of associated with his father, and also associated with Senator Joseph McCarthy, the Republican Wisconsin senator who was most famous for these sort of communist, what turned out to be witch hunts of sort of launching into these accusations and these investigations of picking a target and then trying to find what they were guilty of. And Bobby, in some cases, that was his practice. I mean, with the Teamsters, with Jimmy Hoffa, he investigated Hoffa in the Senate. He decided that Hoffa had done something wrong, and he was, never really going to let that go. And so he just kept going after him. And eventually, of course, Hoffa was very corrupt, and he was able to find something on Hoffa and able to send him away. But at the same time, I think this was a sort of tenaciousness, this I'm going to get you idea, and that's where Robert Kennedy's ruthlessness really took hold. But then again, there's also this softness to him on the inside, this sense of moral right and wrong, and even in situations where it wasn't politically palatable to pursue certain positions, he decided to do it because he knew it was the right thing to do, it was the right moment, the right time.
Yeah, and two of his most powerful enemies in politics were LBJ and the director of the FBI. The director of the FBI was gathering
Hoover, yeah.
Jagger Hoover was collecting information on Martin Luther King Jr. about his illicit affairs and recording his affairs in hotel rooms and pushing Bobby to do something about that. And LBJ did not want Bobby to be his VP. I mean, even when the stuff about Vietnam came up, where Bobby said, "Look, we need a political negotiation going on, not just a military one." LBJ wanted strictly a military one, and so he had these political adversaries that made it difficult for him to get done what he wanted to get done.
Yeah, I'll take a couple of those points in a row. With J. Edgar Hoover, it's I was talking about Jimmy Hoffa a second ago when he says Bobby Kennedy is just another lawyer now, and it's ironic that one of the people who completely agreed with him was the director of the FBI who was helping lead the investigation to put Jimmy Hoffa behind bars. When Bobby comes back from his post-Thanksgiving vacation to Florida, he returns and finds that his direct line to J. Edgar Hoover no longer exists, to J. Edgar Hoover's desk. And he goes, and Nate says, "What are we going to do about this?" And he says, "Don't you know those people don't work for us anymore?" And when it comes to Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover's relationship, J. Edgar Hoover operated the FBI, in the words of Taylor Branch, as a politically loyal detective agency for Lyndon Johnson, in which Lyndon Johnson had suspicions and he would ferret them out. And I'll give the example of the day of the New Hampshire primary. Bobby Kennedy was having lunch with the Wall Street Journal, and you hear Lyndon Johnson talk about this in his tape recordings from that very day. And I looked into Bobby's day book, his calendar, and I found lunch with the Wall Street Journal in his calendar. How did he know? Well, the FBI protected the Attorney General of the United States. The FBI reported back to J. Edgar Hoover, and J. Edgar Hoover reported back to the President of the United States, giving him intelligence about the whereabouts of his political enemies. And LBJ also speculated that Bobby was having the Wall Street Journal investigate the president's finances and how he made all of his money in radio stations and television stations in Texas and elsewhere. And there's that relationship between the law enforcement and the White House, and then you have LBJ completely paranoid of what Bobby's going to do, not thinking he has complete grasp of the Democratic Party, and in some cases too, you don't have Bobby helping his own case when he is giving an interview to Brent Bradley of Newsweek at the time, who later becomes the legendary editor of the Washington Post, talking about how, the Northern Democrats all want me. Johnson doesn't want to take me because he wants a Johnson administration with no Kennedys in it. And so it turns out that Lyndon Johnson sees this interview, Ben Bradley posts all of it, and Bobby didn't think he was going to. And Bobby ends up apologizing to Lyndon Johnson on the day of the Civil Rights Bill signing. And there's this very icy scene between the two of them. And we knew that they didn't really like each other. And I think this is maybe what they really didn't like about each other that very day. And Bobby even writes about it in a memo to file to himself a few days later, saying the relationship was improving. I should have never trusted Ben Bradley.
Well, Bobby and this political operative Corbin were working real hard on trying to get him a vice presidency, and he thought he was going to be able to leverage that. But as Goldwater made the Republican nomination, it made him less likely to be significant. And so Hubert Humphrey became the VP. And then Bobby did this enormous campaign in New York, accused of being a carpetbagger for coming to New York to be a senator after he didn't really live there. That campaign was incredible. And the descriptions you have of the crowds just wanting to just touch him and grabbing his hands and shaking his hands to the point that his hands were bleeding at the end of the day. It's amazing what happened in New York.
Yeah, Robert Kennedy would go into situations, and they weren't really prepared for it at first. He went to Jones Beach, which is on Long Island, and they expected they were going to walk the beachfront that day. It was a hot day in late summer. But before they even get out of the parking lot, they realized that the crowds are too enormous and too unruly, that they decide to form a police cordon around him, and it's still not affecting the crowds. There's still more people building up. They decide maybe if the people can't see him any longer, that he should just, they will disperse. So they have Bobby literally on the ground, and they decide to move towards a bathhouse. So they have Bobby crawling on the ground in the middle of the hot summer with a police cordon, arm's length around them, inching forward. They get close enough. Bobby pops to his feet, runs for the bathhouse, jumps over a fence, through another doorway, and then they decide how they're going to get out of there. And this is the kind of pandemonium that just followed him around everywhere. In Massapequa, New York, a police officer had a heart attack with the surging crowds. A Republican politician on Long Island suggested that police get hazard pay when Bobby came to town. And he did a very good job of masking this sort of fear in his face, but every now and then you'd see it flash in his eyes. When he's in Grand Central Terminal, that big train station in the center of New York, there are people coming at them at the escalators, and he stands up between the two of them and he shouts, "Please get back. There are children. People are going to get crushed." And people they need to touch him, and then they melt away. They touch him, and they push back. And that was a part of the process, and Bobby understood that. He, would come home and clean his hands with ointment every night to guard off infections. Some of his advanced men saw him at his home that he was staying at in Glen Cove, Long Island, and they go out to the backyard. They don't even recognize him because he looks so beat up and so beleaguered. He reaches out, not with his right hand, but with his left hand, and just the two little fingers on the end, because the rest of his hands are so swollen and battered and bandaged. And he says, "This is what I want to talk to you about." And the other thing about the crowd, too, is that people weren't really listening to him. They weren't hearing his speeches. They were just seeing him, and he felt that his message wasn't getting through. And he was really concerned because there was a lot of Democratic opposition to Bobby, not just for being a carpetbagger, but for his relationship with Senator McCarthy, but for his investigations and some of the political things he had done to liberal groups in New York City and around the state. That they didn't want him, and they had a very popular, very liberal Republican senator who opposed Goldwater, one of the few people who really vocally spoke out against Goldwater in the country.
Keating, right?
Kenneth Keating, that's right. Yeah, silver-haired, undefeated, 64 years old, looked like your grandfather, and Bobby knew it was going to be very, very tough to beat him in some cases because he was just he's a solid representative of the state.
Yeah. Well, his life goes on in spite of what was probably the toughest race he ever faced, because he didn't want to be a politician. He didn't want to run for office when he was young. He wanted to serve Jack, but he didn't want to be in elections. But then comes 60, and then comes 68, and the tragedy of Sirhan, and I'm not really sure if anybody's ever investigated the conspiracy there. I mean, I am a conspiracy theorist of the Jack Kennedy assassination. I was in Louisiana when the Clay Shaw trial was going on, and so I am convinced that more than one person was involved, even though Bobby said, no, there was no conspiracy. It was strictly Lee Harvey Oswald after the Royal Warren Commission report. But I'm convinced there was, and I wonder about the Sirhan conspiracies as well.
Bobby, Bobby on the assassination of JFK and on the Warren report, he questioned what had happened, just like the whole country questioned what had happened after the initial shock. And he did make some effort to find out if something he had done perhaps influenced what had befallen his brother. But I think at a certain point too, he just realized this doesn't matter anymore. That he's gone, he's dead, and we have to move on. He was incredibly pained by questions about conspiracy. One of the first times he was asked about it, he was still Attorney General. He was on a trip to Poland, and a graduate student asked him, and he said very very curtly, I accept the findings of, that it was one person. And he was asked again in New York, and there would be tears in his eyes. And he just didn't understand why people in some ways were so obsessed with it. But, then there's Jacqueline Kennedy, who said, she's disappointed in some ways that it was some quote unquote silly little communist, and wasn't killed for civil rights. He wasn't a martyr for some greater issue that she felt would deserve that kind of sacrifice. And I think what Robert Kennedy came away from the assassination of his brother and was that change happens, and change can come into our lives so quickly, and we need to be prepared for it. And really it was the kickoff of a generation, of a decade of change and tumult in American life. And I think one of the reasons Bobby became so poignant for people was that they understood that he was imbued with this radical change of the country. Like I said, he had the hair of someone who had experienced the 60s, even though he wore it on top of the leader who led them into that decade. I think when it comes to Robert Kennedy's assassination, I haven't studied it closely enough to really have a firm opinion about what happened. It was a sad end. He didn't really take a lot of precautions to protect himself. He rejected that because he felt that people who write don't shoot, and people who shoot don't write. And that's how he lived his life, and he wanted to be out in the open. You see it on the cover of the book. He's very vulnerable just in that moment. And that moment is 66, is 1966, when Governor Pat Brown was running against a somewhat washed-up Hollywood actor named Ronald Reagan. But you look at Bobby on the cover because you see the Pat Brown sign in the background. But you see Bobby on the cover of that and he's in basically a procession in an open car. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of people around him. There are people on the rooftops nearby. The open car and the rooftop and all of that. All of this. Imagine how fresh that was. Seeing that 3 years after the assassination of JFK, it still has resonance now, 50 years later. And so I just think that Bobby Kennedy really said the country, needs people out there, needs people to serve, and I'm going to do that. And I'm going to put my life on the line for that.
Quickly, because we only have like a minute or two left, another aspect of RFK's character, how supportive his wife was, and how much of a family man he was with Jackie a lot. He was with John and Caroline a lot because he felt like he had to fulfill a role as a family leader.
Yeah, and I would say, too, that I think Ethel doesn't get the kind of attention that maybe she deserves. While Jackie was glamorous and the First Lady and so young, she went to a very dark place after the assassination of JFK, as did Bobby in a lot of ways, and they could really mourn together in a unique way that really no one else could. And yet there's Ethel, and you had a very deep faith in God, very pious person, believed that, Jack was in heaven, life goes on, and we have to be here for the present. She, they had all of these children, and she continued to get pregnant, continued to have children, and she really kept him in the present. I think if he hadn't done that, he would not have been the same leader, he would not have been the same person, would not have had that sort of optimism, and because he wouldn't have been, she was a fatalist in many ways, but he's also such an optimist, and I think that he needed people to balance that in his life, and I think Ethel really served in that way, and in what I think is maybe an unsung role compared to the glamour of Jacqueline Kennedy.
And that is such a beautiful epilogue. We've been talking with John Bohrer. The book is The Revolution of Robert Kennedy, From Power to Protest After JFK. And I want to finish with a quote that Teddy attributed to Bobby, but he had borrowed from someone else, and that is, "Some men see things as they are and ask why. I see things that never were and ask why not." And we need leaders like that again. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I remind you, if you don't catch our broadcast on 88 FM, you can catch YouTube, our YouTube channel, Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. Thanks for listening.